I'm going to turn it over to Mildred Lewis to introduce our keynote speaker.
All right, thank you, Chris. Good morning, Lainey. Hey. I've had the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker this morning. I met Dr. Robert Tiranishi about 5 years ago in Washington, D.C. at an Anna Peasy conference, where he was, I think, the first person that I ever heard discuss disaggregating data for the AAPI community, which was a fascinating presentation that you did. And I'm a fan, and I was hooked ever since. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about who he is. Robert Tiranishi is a professor of social science and comparative education and the inaugural Morgan and Helen Chu Endowed Chair in Asian American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's also co-director for the Institute for Immigration, Globalization, and Education, and a senior faculty fellow with the Steinhardt Institute for Higher Education Policy. His research examines the causes and consequences of inequality in higher education. Tiranishi's research has been influential to federal, state, and institution policy related to college access and completion. He has testified before Congress on the Higher Education Reauthorization Act, the College Cost Reduction and Affordability Act, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. His research has been referenced in U.S. Supreme Court cases on disaggregation and affirmative action. He also recently served as a strategic planning and restructuring consultant for the Ford Foundation. Tiranishi has received national awards from the Association for the Study of Higher Education, NASPA, the National Institute for the Study of Transfer Students, and the Campaign for College Opportunity. He was also the recipient of the Martin Luther King Jr. Faculty Award and Daniel E. Griffiths Research Award at New York University. Tiranishi was named one of the nation's top up-and-coming leaders by the Diverse Issues in Higher Education and ranked by Education Week as one of the nation's most influential education scholars. In 2011, he was appointed by the Secretary of State, Arne Duncan, to the U.S. Department of Education's Equity and Excellence Commission. And in 2014, he was appointed by President Barack Obama to the National Board of Education Sciences. Tiranishi was a National Institute for Mental Health postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute. He received his BA from the University of California, Santa Cruz in sociology, and his MA and PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, in higher education and organizational change. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tiranishi to the stage.
All right, good morning, Lainey. And thank you, Dean Lewis, for the introduction. And when you talked to me about that meeting we had about like 4 or 5 years ago, it was a very different time in Washington, a very different experience. So it's nice to be able to reflect back on that and the work that we had been doing. I also want to thank Chris and David, who graciously reached out to me to extend the invitation for me to join you today. It's really an honor to be able to join you as you guys engage in discussions about the important work you guys are doing as a campus community. You know, we need, colleges need more opportunities to have these kinds of discussions across a broad set of constituents about some of the priorities that you guys have and the different strategies that are being employed and you know, the progress you guys are making as a campus community. So the research I share with you today describes the opportunities, experiences, and outcomes of Asian American and Pacific Islanders in higher education. This is a population I've studied pretty extensively over the past 2 decades, and a group that's a sizable concentration of students here at Laney, of course. I'll also talk about the fact that Laney, like many other public institutions in California, is now a minority-servant institution. because of the high concentration of APIs and Latinos that they're serving. So this presents an opportunity for Laney and other public institutions in the state to engage in important conversations about what it means to be minority serving, not just minority enrolling. So a lot of times we see institutions, they pride themselves on being minority serving institutions. Really, that's a de facto, I guess, designation, right? It's a matter of just your demographic makeup. What we're trying to push in the field is a broader conversation about what it means to actually serve minority students as opposed to just enroll them. So the work I'm going to talk about is at the intersections of my interest in demography and the changing demographic landscape of the nation, and my interest in understanding how higher ed can be more effective in promoting equity and inclusion. So this work has a national context. Demographic projections suggest the U.S. will be the first major post-industrial society to become a minority majority. The changing demography is primarily driven by an increase in immigrants who have doubled in just the past 20 years. And 82% of the projected growth will be attributed to immigrants over the next couple of decades. So fueled primarily by immigrant origin youth, population estimates reveal that by 2020, more than half of the children in the US will be minorities. Of course, we already are witnessing this demographic phenomenon in our state and in our major metropolitan hubs, places like the Bay Area and Southern California. For our state and the nation, this means expanding opportunities and reducing barriers must be at the forefront of our higher ed agenda. So the pursuit of a more equitable system is not only an essential component of the democratic mission of higher education, right? So we often talk about the democratic mission of colleges and universities, but it's necessary that we think about a more equitable and accessible and inclusive system of higher education, considering we're in the midst of these rapid demographic change that we're seeing in our nation and, especially in communities like this. So the research I'll share with you today is a part of a larger research initiative that I have. I've led this work for about the past 15 years, and it's the National Commission on AAPI Research and Education. So we conduct applied research, and really what we were concerned about early on was the exclusion and misrepresentation of AAPIs in broader discourse on America's commitment to equity and social justice. Early on, we had this model minority myth, right? And it's this idea that all Asian Americans are high achieving, academically successful. They're setting the bar in terms of their performance on things like the SAT and access to higher ed. And in a lot of cases, we're finding there wasn't a lot of evidence of that. So it's like, well, where is the data? To what extent are we seeing a high rate of performance among APIs? To what extent is that true for all API subgroups? What do we really know about APIs in higher education? Really my concern about this, it's about APIs, but it's also about the need for higher education to have a better sense of who their students are, what are their unique needs and challenges, and how can we best serve them. So our goal is to offer solutions and strategies to inform the work of a lot of constituents in higher ed. So it's higher ed institutions and the folks that work in higher ed, but it's also policymakers. It's folks who are doing work in advocacy around higher ed. And it's also researchers, right? Because we're seeing the same patterns in terms of how APIs are perceived and treated in the research. So Through this project, we've shed light on the extent to which the API community is a large and growing sector of the U.S. population and increasingly relevant to thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion. The API population is a significant contributor to the growth of the U.S. as a whole. So, a lot of perceptions we have about APIs is thinking about the population back in like the 1960s, right? So the Chinese population in places like San Francisco, the Japanese population, the API population, and the mantra used to be, yeah, they're important, but they're too small to matter. It's like, how do we really study them because they're such a small number? They're too small to really matter when it comes to bigger institutional priorities. And the API population really was quite small, relatively small, up till about the 1960s, but it's been doubling in size nearly every decade since then. And between 2000 and 2010, the API population increased more than any other major racial group. And what we're also seeing is that while these trends are important for thinking about like the changing demography of our nation in the past, we're seeing that the projections are showing that these trends are going to continue in the future. The API population is projected to reach nearly 40 million people by 2050. And what we're seeing is that these demographic trends have a lot of implications for what we're seeing in enrollment trends in K-12 and higher education. So public K-12 enrollment of APIs grew fourfold over a 30-year period from about 600,000 students to 2.5 million in the K-12 system. And while the proportional representation of whites and blacks are projected to increase by about 4% each, APIs and Latinos are projected to increase by more than 30%. In higher ed, over the same time period, API enrollment grew fivefold. And while college enrollment is projected to increase for all groups, APIs will experience a particularly high proportional increase of around 35% over the next decade. Unfortunately, the prevailing assumption that APIs are a model minority is inaccurate, misleading, and damaging for the population. This is particularly problematic because it often drives a treatment of API students and masks their unique needs and challenges. So in one of my recent books, I highlight the story of two API high school students, Tony and Peng, which exemplifies this point. And just to provide some context, what I did is I traveled throughout the state of California and I talked to API students in a number of different kinds of high schools, public comprehensive high schools in all parts of the state. This is what they make us do when we get our doctorates, right? So it was fascinating though, because I got to spend time in places like the Central Valley. And, so of course I hit the obvious places like San Francisco and parts of LA, but to spend time in places like the Central Valley was really revealing. So on the surface, Tony and Peng, they seem very similar, aside from Tony being male, Peng being female. At the time of the study, both were seniors. They were only a year apart in age. They both attended comprehensive public high schools. They had similar GPAs. They both aspired to attend college immediately after high school. All right, so this is a story of like what we hear about kids in California. When you look more closely at the lives of Tony and Peng, their stories diverge quite a bit. So Tony is, here's a quiz for you guys, pop quiz. So Tony's an ABC. Yeah, American-born Chinese. Yeah, we have acronyms for all these interesting demographic phenomena. So Tony, we hear this story also. His father came to the U.S. to attend college at UC Berkeley. He lives in a comfortable middle-class household with his mom his dad, his younger sister. Peng is Hmong, and she arrived in the U.S. via refugee status when she was 8 years old. Her family was from Laos. They spent 20 years in a refugee camp, and actually in Thailand, and Peng was actually born in this refugee camp. Her parents had no formal education. Her 2 older brothers dropped out of the same high school Peng was attending. In her parents' household, she had 6 siblings. Peng, it turns out, didn't live with them. So this is a high school senior, right? So I'm sitting down talking to this high school senior, and I find out she doesn't actually live with their parents. It turns out Peng got married when she was 16 years old, and she lived with her husband and her husband's parents, her husband's brother, and the brother's wife also lived in the household. So Peng told me, sometimes I feel all alone. I've gone further in school than anybody else in my family. I see how my family is struggling to make money and how my brothers are because they both dropped out of high school. I don't want to go down that same road. I want to be the first in my family to finish high school, the first in my family to go to college. All right, so if you think about the perception that we have about Asian Americans, right, and then you think about the story of Peng, you know, it starts to reveal this kind of contrast that exists and the challenges that we have in changing the narrative about the Asian American experience. So what Peng and Tony's stories represent is the extent to which APIs are a heterogeneous racial group in terms of their ethnicities, their languages, their cultures, and immigration histories. So the racial category, Asian American and Pacific Islander, is actually inclusive of 48 different ethnic groups, a range of immigration histories, 300 different languages, and wide variation in income and social status. In terms of my point about the immigration histories, I'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing among undocumented AAPI college students. So within the context of this incredible heterogeneity, taking the API population more seriously means acknowledging that sweeping generalizations conceal incidences where APIs are facing significant disparities in educational attainment. So consider that access to higher ed remains a significant challenge for many AAPI subgroups. 55 to 65% of Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander adults have not enrolled in any post-secondary education. 40% of Southeast Asians have not even completed high school in the US. And among API students who do attend college, it's important to recognize that they attend a wide range of post-secondary outcomes. So half of Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander students are leaving college without earning a degree. That's 3 to 5 times the likelihood of dropping out compared to East Asians and South Asians. East Asians and South Asians have a greater likelihood of having a college degree as well as continuing on to earn an advanced degree. So these data represent the significant challenges that exist among marginalized and vulnerable groups of AAPI students. And unfortunately, these differential outcomes are concealed by aggregated data and result in AAPI students being overlooked and underserved. Right, so a lot of times we have, we're kind of pushed to think about, or to be data-driven, right? So we need to look at the data, see what the data is telling us. In most cases, APIs are treated as a single category, a single racial category. And so what those numbers conceal is a range of different experiences and outcomes that exist between API subgroups. We've also learned that disaggregated data matters for understanding campus climate, the campus climate experiences of API students. So we did a study of campus climate for API students at UCLA, and what we found were analysis across racial groups revealed that API student experiences were more parallel to other minority students than their white peers. And this was true of their sense of belonging, their satisfaction with their academic and social experiences, and a lot of other indicators relative to the campus climate. And it's interesting because you would wonder, why is this such a groundbreaking finding? And in a lot of the literature, they group Asian Americans and whites together and compare them to blacks and Latinos. So they're basically saying Asians are this kind of honorary white group. They have this kind of, they don't have a racialized experience the same way we see among blacks and Latinos. And then we found that there were differences between API ethnic subgroups with regards to their campus climate experience. So Southeast Asian students reported higher levels of dissatisfaction compared to other API subgroups. And then we found differences in terms of the effect of their peer interactions, their level of engagement with faculty, their perception of discrimination that exists on campus. But it was really interesting because there was no clear trends to it. It's not like we could say, well, Southeast Asians have a worse kind of experience with campus racial climate. For some indicators, Southeast Asians had a more difficult time. For other instances, we saw that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders had a more challenging experience. So this idea oh, but we could just include APIs in our work around campus climate, I don't think it's that simple, right? So we have to think about how we can address the needs of different subgroups within the population. So the size, growth, and heterogeneity of APIs shows us that we need to think more differently. We need to think differently about the relevance of the population to institutional, state, and federal priorities. To this point, I want to begin by talking about some research that I've done with Onapisi campus partners, and then I want to talk about some research I've done on undocumented students in higher education. And I think both studies have a lot of implications for the work that's happening at Laney. So one thing we've been doing with Onapisi's is we've been trying to get a sense of what these campuses do with their money, right? So once they become Onapisi's, once they go out for a grant, what is it that they spend their money on? And to what extent does that have an impact on what's happening in terms of the capacity of the institution to serve their students? And then the other thing we've been doing is conducting longitudinal research that examines the extent to which Onapisi-funded programs has a measurable impact on student success. So I'm going to talk about that latter body of work that we have. We utilize a research design that enabled us to longitudinally track API students in Onapisi-funded programs and compare their outcomes against comparable groups of API students who did not participate in these programs. And so I'll be able to highlight some of the findings that we have for one particular campus, which is actually down the road, De Anza College. De Anza has a large concentration of API students. They make up about 40% of the total enrollment. Chinese, Vietnamese, and Filipinos are the three largest subgroups on campus. They have a long history and commitment to community and civic engagement. And they want their students to be, quote, socially responsible leaders in their communities, the nation, and the world. One distinguishing feature of the institution is the APALI program. This is the Asian Pacific American Leadership Institute, which you guys may have heard of. So what De Anza did with their grant money, and they were a part of the first cohort of Onapisi grantees back in 2008. They developed learning communities that paired developmental English with an API literature course. So the program also included wraparound support services with an embedded counselor, and the counselor provided support both in and out of the classroom, which is a neat design. So what we did is we compared the outcomes of API students in these learning communities with characteristically similar students who did not enroll in learning communities. So if you look at the figure on the left, students in the impact API learning communities had a higher rate of transition from developmental to college level English compared to the control group. And the figure on the right is analysis of students one term following the intervention. And the results revealed that impact API students were more likely to pass their college level English course. Finally, students in the impact API learning communities were more likely to earn an associate's degree and accomplish this in less time, right? So this was a really involved study. We were able to track students over a long period of time to look at not just what was happening in terms of their immediate experience, but how that experience translated into both short-term and long-term academic outcomes. Okay, I have another project called DocuScholars. So I'm not sure if you guys have heard about this work we've been doing at UCLA. But this is an effort to respond to the unique needs and challenges of undocumented students in higher education. One of our initiatives in this project, we conducted the largest national study of undocumented students. So this was actually a survey study that we did. And perhaps the most important theme in our findings was the remarkable diversity that exists within the undocumented student college student population. So undocumented students who responded to our survey, they're Black, they're white, they're Latino, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. They're representing positions along the full spectrum of socioeconomic status. They also had a range of immigration histories originating from 55 different countries of origin, and they spoke a wide variety of different languages and dialects. Respondents also, they attended every type of post-secondary institution, 2-year and 4-year colleges, institutions that are both public and private, and colleges that range in selectivity. And I think that what the demographic portrait of undocumented students really teaches us is two things. First, no college or university should assume that these issues are not relevant to their campus community. Second, the higher ed community needs to look beyond stereotypes and assumptions that often drive their understanding and treatment of this population. All right, so we have this kind of perception of who an undocumented student is and what their needs are, and then we're creating practices and services based on those perceptions, not really taking the time to really understand who these students are. And to that point, I really appreciate the work you guys are doing to have a lot of student-driven initiatives in the service of undocumented students. So my work with undocumented students connects with my work on API students in a number of ways. So first, we need to be careful about the generalizations we make about undocumented students. I'll give you an example of UCLA. We have approximately 700 undocumented undergrads, and over half of them are API students, right? So that blows people away on campus, right? They could never have imagined that half of the undocumented students at UCLA are API students. Second, we need to understand that undocumented API students have needs and challenges that distinguish them from other undocumented students on campus, right? So what they're experiencing as undocumented students is different than what we may find or what we may assume are the issues for other subgroups. For example, we're finding that many undocumented API students do not qualify for DACA or AB 540. So we often even count who's undocumented based on whether they qualify for AB 540 or DACA, right? And so you have to think about, well, what are limitations in using that as a proxy for even figuring out how many students are undocumented on campus? And of course, what it means is that it limits their access to things like in-state tuition, different forms of state aid. And it's interesting because even when you try to adjust their status when it comes to higher ed, it's really complicated because of how things like AB 540 are set up, right? So we have a few instances at UCLA where students have gotten into UCLA, they find out that they can't pay in-state tuition, they can't get access to aid, so they say, okay, so I'm not gonna enroll, I'm gonna go back to community college, I'll pay the out-of-state tuition at community college, be there for 2 years, which would then have me qualify for AB 540. Turns out that that doesn't qualify them for AB 540 because the only kind of education that you can get for the 2-year, there's like a 2-year criteria for attending school in California. It has to be to get a diploma or some type of high school equivalent certificate or diploma. So then they find out, oh, I just spent 2 years at a community college and I still can't get in-state tuition at UCLA. But these are the kinds of things that we're seeing, and and we're seeing it more so among API undocumented students. We're also finding that undocumented API students are undocumented for different reasons than is the case for other undocumented students. So we're seeing a number of instances where they overstayed a visa. So they came in perhaps as an international student, attended community college, and then they ended up working. And then when they go back to school, they find out that they can no longer enroll in school as an international student. Their visa is expired. They're now undocumented students. A lot of them are coming over without their families. So we're seeing this particularly among Koreans. But we're also seeing other instances where, so it like varies from one population to another. We're seeing differences in terms of what the experience is for Filipino students who are undocumented versus Koreans. We're also seeing a number of Vietnamese who are undocumented now, which is a very kind of new trend. And so it just kind of goes to show like we need to think with a more open mind about who our undocumented students are, especially among APIs. So I guess in conclusion, I want to begin by saying that I think that there's great potential for Laney to do exciting things as an institution that's so rich in its demographic makeup, right? So we have to think about this as an opportunity and not as as something that's negative, right? So a lot of times people talk about minorities like through a deficit lens, and I like to think about it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to think critically and constructively about what it means to be minority serving as opposed to minority enrolling. And it's an opportunity for Laney to demonstrate the importance of what it means to be an MSI within the context of their role as a community college. So how we measure the success of our students can't just be within the context of conferring more associate degrees or certificates. But we have to put them on a trajectory to also support and serve their families and their communities, and to think about the next generation of thought leaders and change agents in our state, right? So we don't have enough discussion about that. A lot of it's about just like hitting these numbers, right? We need more degrees, we need more certificates. And a lot of our students come to our institutions with that frame of mind, right? I want to go to college so I can get a degree, I can make more money, I can take care of my family. We have to also get them to think about, college can be much more than that for you and your families and your communities. I believe strongly in the ability of institutions to leverage their status and funding as a minority servant institution to drive innovation and to support institutional change. Our research suggests that establishing buy-in and collaboration across campus is one key ingredient to success. So using opportunities like this to have a discussion across campus about what you guys are doing as an Onapeasy, what lessons you can learn from that, and how that could be applied more generally to other aspects of what you're doing as a college. I think it's also to think very critically about high impact practices. So, you know, it's great to focus attention on certain priorities. I think it's also important though to not, I guess, put all your eggs in one basket, right? So we have to think more comprehensively about the services that we're providing. Focus a lot on the lessons that we learn. So it's not just like we need to make sure this program succeeds, but it's like what can we learn through this process that could help inform what we do over the long run. And of course, you know, assessment's important for identifying what we could learn from different programs in terms of modifying programs, replicating them, bringing them to scale. And so to that point, you know, I think a culture of inquiry is really critical for learning and improving, as well as for sharing with a broader audience the work you guys are doing. So I hope you guys use the different initiatives you have and the research that may be associated with it to not only like share with each other what works, what could be improved, but also to share with other people in higher education what you guys are doing and the difference it makes. You know, this is what it's going to take. You know, we have to have broader conversations, whether it's regionally with some of our campuses in the local area, whether it's across the state, but also nationally. We need a greater attention to what's happening in terms of demographic change and the needs and challenges of our students because of their unique needs and backgrounds. So thank you very much. I'll take some questions. I think I got a little bit of time. I'm looking at Chris to see if he has an objection to that.
I think we owe you a little bit of time for questions.
Okay. Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question was about Russian Americans, right? And how they get classified into like the Asian American category. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay, so that's a really interesting question because what comprises a racial category is really something that's it's really complicated, and it's driven by politics, it's driven by society, it's driven by researchers, experts, right? So, you know, one thing that makes, or I guess puts people into one category versus another is by who they're not. Right, so an interesting thing happens when it comes to Asia so one way people think about it is from a regional standpoint, right? So geography. They say, well, Russia's not really Europe, right? And we think of Europe as white, and so are they Asian? And Russians in the US would not count as Asian Americans. They would be categorized as white. But what's more complicated is when it comes to like Pakistani, you know, so these are like border regions of Russia. And it's like, where do you draw the line in terms of when somebody becomes Asian American and when they don't count as white? And so part of it is driven by identity, right? So who they think they are in terms of how they identify in America, but also it's driven by classification and where they're put when they come to the US. But yeah, so the Asian American population is really complicated. The boundaries move in terms of who's included, who's excluded. And it goes to show, like, you know, race is not a fixed phenomenon in America, right? It's constantly evolving. You know, you go to Central and South America, Latin America, right? You have Asians in these regions, and then they come to the US. And they speak Spanish as their primary language, and then often their Asian heritage language is their second language, and then they come to the US and then they speak English as their third language. And then they come to America and everybody says, you know, you're not Latino, you're Asian. And technically, the concept of Hispanic is that you can be Hispanic and of any race, right? So you could be black, white, Latino, or black, white, Asian, and be Hispanic. And so it's really a challenge in terms of you know, if we think about what race is in America, it's literally a project that's ongoing. Yes?
When you say high-impact practices, when I think of that, I know about like maybe involving students in research or in community engagement. Are those the kinds of like service learning? Can you talk a little bit about high-impact practices that sound helpful for Asian students?
Yeah, so I think something that's really important for Asian American students is things that get them engaged, things that get them involved. And so one thing I hear often when I go to colleges is like, well, the Asian students, they're not very vocal. You know, they're quiet and they don't really speak up in class. And I tell them, you know, think about their experiences throughout their lives where they're being told you don't have nothing to say. Like, they're being perceived as a group that is quiet and, you know, doesn't have anything to contribute. There's these studies that have been done about perceptions of Asians and their leadership abilities, right? So there's this question about why don't we have more Asian Americans in positions of leadership? And part of it is like they're not seen as leadership material. Like they don't have the qualities that we want in a leader. And so it's like you got to think about like what happens over time, over the developmental trajectory of our API students, and how that contributes to what they might be, how they might be behaving in and out of the classroom. And so the more we can say, you know, hey, we do value you and your experience. We do want to hear what's going on with you and your families and how we could best support you. I think that it gets students more engaged. They have more agency and they want to get more involved. I think of that as in terms of high impact practices for API students. Oh, and to that point, real quick, think about history, right? How history has been written for Asian Americans. There's very little opportunity for Asians to even see themselves in history books, right? When you think about American history. And so that's what's interesting about like when you got a learning community that has like developmental English coupled with like a Asian American history course or Asian American literature course, right? Wow, I didn't know Asian Americans were writing about, you know, the history of Asian Americans. Like, it opens them up to a whole new world. Yes, sir.
I've been reading about ICE's recent emphasis on targeting Asian American populations or Asian populations for deportation. Since our students don't have any DACA protection, is there any effort to protect their presence in the community college and provide them a safe environment?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I'll tell you one thing that I've heard, and of course, you know, a lot of these things we don't have good data, right? So some of it's perception, some of it's kind of what we're just seeing in the community. But a friend of mine in Washington, D.C., we had a conference call. She says, you know, Homeland Security contacted me. She's a she came in as a refugee. She became a naturalized citizen. She says, Homeland Security contacted me. They said, I have to come in, and they want to go over all my paperwork that I had when I applied for citizenship. And she says, you know, what am I supposed to do? Like, I'm a citizen. I have rights as a U.S. citizen, but I think I have to comply, you know? And so it was hard for her to even find an attorney who knew how to handle this kind of situation. But we're hearing that among a lot of Southeast Asians in particular. And there's another deportation action that's being practiced a lot more, which is for Southeast Asian refugees who commit a crime in the U.S., right? So they're going back and they're looking at who has a criminal record, and they're targeting them and deporting them. So, you know, so that's kind of half of your question. The other half is about what higher ed can do. And I think the more we can let students know that we acknowledge who they are, what they're experiencing, and that they could come to us for support, I think the better. But with that said, we have to think about what support they need. So at UCLA, what we found is that we need a lot of attorneys involved. So whether that's in our law school, whether that's our relationship with law firms and or immigration attorneys in the community, or if it means we go and hire attorneys who can provide pro bono support for our students and our families. That's what we felt was really needed, especially around DACA. And not just the deportation of our students, but our students' family members. So we're seeing a lot of instances where family members are being deported, and it's having a real severe effect on our students.
So here at the college, a lot of our programs that are AA or our CTE programs are clearly considered higher ed. Can you speak about any data or research that pertains to Asian Americans, Islanders, Southeast Asians, and looking at programs like the trade? Like trade? Like the trade, like field trade, machining, welding, CTE programs.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about, or I'm not aware of any research on that. In fact, you know, the research on certificates in trade generally is not, there's not a lot of it out there. And I think what concerns me about that is not just that the fact we have a lack of knowledge about what's happening, it's that more and more there's this emphasis on workplace training, you know, degrees and certificates, the pathway to a bachelor's degree, but we're not acknowledging the, I guess, a range of things that community colleges do in a community and why that's important. So we don't have a good sense of how much education and what kind has an impact on students relative to their employment and their wages. And there's some interesting research that's being done, and you guys might want to look into this, where they're looking at workforce needs in a region, so in a geographic region, and then they're looking at the extent to which that aligns with some of the enrollment patterns we're seeing of students in a particular institution in that region. So I know Pasadena City College is doing some of that. I'm starting to do some of that work in Las Vegas. But it's really interesting because what it does is it helps to not just align what you're doing with what the needs are in terms of opportunities for work in the community, but once you start offering more curriculum in this area, it draws more students, right? So the big one, two big ones in Vegas that I'm focusing on are teachers and nurses. So that's like huge in Vegas. They just have a real big shortage of both teachers and nurses. You know, so that might be something you want to look at, is maybe exploring a consultant to do some work to look at the regional needs and to what extent you're aligned with that.
I understand that you've agreed to offer a workshop this afternoon or to talk with people, maybe continue this conversation at 1 o'clock?
Well,
Is that true?
We canceled it, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't. No one told me. No one told me. I thank you for coming. I think what you're saying today connects, for some of us, it connects with some of the approaches we've been trying to cultivate. And I want to try to make more use of, or get more of these ideas into people's hands and minds about creating community, getting our students to learn each other's names, looking people in the eye, like simple things that could go a long way, right? Little practices and really respecting everybody as full of a, they're as full and complicated as the person looking out at them, right?
Yep.
I hope you can join us for lunch at least, and maybe some lucky people will get to continue a conversation with you.
Yeah, and I've been talking to David about coming back. So I will be back, and I'll find a way where I could be more engaged with On a PZ program. So I'll be back.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you. One more time for Dr. Robert T. Teranishi.